"We need space from you. Please don't reach out anymore at all." That was the message, cold, sterile, and final. A son dismissing his father as if love could be severed with two sentences. In that moment, years of sacrifice and devotion collapsed into silence, and what followed was a journey through betrayal, consequence, and the rediscovery of dignity. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. I wake up each morning to the sound of gulls circling over the harbor and the faint clatter of halyards knocking against masts. Port Townsend is not a large place, but the town carries the weight of salt and time. The air is often damp, briny, and cold, rolling off the Strait of Juan de Fuca with the kind of persistence that seeps into your bones. My house sits on a bluff overlooking the water. It is modest in shape, but heavy with memory. Photographs of my late wife, Nora, are tucked into corners. A shell collection she once arranged sits in a glass bowl by the window, and her handwriting still marks recipe cards I cannot bring myself to throw away. It has been years since she passed, but the space still feels as though she might walk back in with a tray of coffee at any moment. Routine keeps me steady. Even in retirement, I wake early, pour a cup of strong coffee, and spread the company ledgers across the oak table. Carter Marine and Outfitters was my life's work. Born from a dream in my 20s and a shop barely larger than a garage. Now, it stands as a recognizable name across Puget Sound. Though I stepped away formally at 63, I still go over numbers and shipping manifests the way a retired sailor keeps polishing brass. It isn't about distrust, it's about discipline. Checking the books is how I measure the tide of each day, a way to reassure myself the vessel I built is still afloat. After the paperwork, I usually walk down to the dock to tinker with the old wooden boat Nora insisted we keep, even after the company expanded. The vessel is not fast, not polished like the yachts you see on Bainbridge, but she is sturdy and familiar. Maintenance is a ritual: fresh oil, a checked rope, a tightened cleat. When I sit on the deck and breathe in cedar shavings and diesel, I remember Nora's laughter echoing across the water during the summers we sailed together. My son Mason is 34 now. He and his wife Haley live on Bainbridge Island in a house far grander than anything I ever thought I would finance. Officially, the mortgage is in their name, but I know the real weight falls back to me. I have been paying property taxes, footing the insurance bills, even sliding funds to cover their club membership dues. It was supposed to be love, a way to smooth their path. I thought if I kept the winds gentle for them, they would learn to sail on their own. Instead, I may have created a pair of passengers who never learned to hold the tiller. Haley is clever in her way, more comfortable on a phone screen than in the kitchen. She is an influencer of sorts, sharing her curated life online, decorating their Christmas dinners like magazine spreads. Each December, they host at their house, arranging silver and white themes that sparkle under too many lights. My role has become that of the quiet guest, sitting near the fireplace while the younger ones clink glasses and snap photos. They call me dad and smile politely, but I can feel how little space I take up in their world. It is easier to stay silent, to nod along, to let them shine. Peace, I tell myself, is worth the sacrifice of being overlooked. In truth, the holidays leave me conflicted. Nora loved Christmas. She baked, she sang hymns, she lit candles in the windows so the house glowed like a beacon. Now those traditions live only in my memory, while Mason and Haley chase appearances and aesthetics. I attend their gatherings because it is expected, because it preserves a fragile thread of connection. I tell myself it is better than nothing. On my phone, I keep the numbers of two people close at hand: Ruth Delgado, the lawyer who has managed my trust documents for years, and Omar Patel, the accountant who once slept on my couch during tax season to finish filings on time. I hardly call them these days. It feels unnecessary, maybe even excessive, to trouble them when life appears calm. Still, I like knowing they are a button away, just in case a storm decides to rise without warning. That's what experience teaches. The weather can shift quicker than you expect. For now, though, the sea outside my window is calm. The harbor looks like glass, reflecting a sky painted in winter grays. The neighborhood is quiet, the streets lined with wreaths and holiday lights. My own porch carries a modest string of bulbs, nothing elaborate, but enough to keep me tethered to tradition. I sip coffee, stare out over the water, and let myself believe the season will pass without disruption. Nora used to warn me not to confuse kindness with obligation, not to turn generosity into debt repayment. I hear her voice whenever I watch the tide roll in. I tell myself this Christmas will be like the last, quiet, polite, uneventful. The truth, which I cannot yet see, is that a single text message is waiting on the horizon, ready to change everything I believe about family, loyalty, and the cost of love. For now, I let the silence rest, unaware of the storm about to break. If you're still watching and feeling the weight of this painful beginning, please comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Christmas Eve arrived with a chill that cut through the cedar trees lining my street. I had spent the afternoon on the porch, wrestling with a strand of lights that refused to cooperate. The bulbs blinked in patches, stubbornly uneven no matter how many times I tested the line. It was the sort of trivial frustration that comes with age, and I muttered under my breath while fastening the cord along the railing. My breath hung in the air, white against the fading daylight. I wanted the porch to glow, even if no one but me would see it. That was when my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out, expecting perhaps a neighbor's holiday greeting or a reminder from the church about the midnight service. Instead, Mason's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, a warmth touched me, my son reaching out, maybe an invitation to come earlier, maybe a word of gratitude. I opened the message, eager, but what I read drained every bit of color from the evening. Don't show up at Christmas dinner. We need this night for our side only. The words sat on the screen like shards of ice. My first instinct was to read them twice, then a third time, hoping I had misunderstood. But the message did not change. Below it appeared a digital firework, bright and celebratory, sent by Haley. She had added her own comment. Hope everyone understands. We want to keep it private this year. A burst of confetti sealed my exclusion, as though being cut off were something to cheer. I felt my throat tighten. The strand of light slipped from my fingers, one bulb shattering on the porch. I steadied myself against the railing, blinking into the dimming light. A father is not supposed to be an outsider at his own family's table. Yet, here it was, spelled out in cold text, sanctioned by my daughter-in-law's enthusiasm. I began typing a reply. 2 words, simple, polite, understood. But as I stared at the phrase, my stomach churned. Understood was what a subordinate says to a superior. It sounded like I was asking permission to exist on the edges of their lives. I deleted the text, the cursor blinking at me like a taunt. My hands trembled, but not from the cold. I slid the phone back into my pocket and stepped inside. The house was still, the faint scent of pine from the small tree in the corner barely masking the emptiness that pressed against me. Nora would have known what to say. She would have reminded me that love must travel with respect, that generosity without gratitude grows into entitlement. I could almost hear her voice. Don't let your kindness become a bill you pay forever. I pulled open the drawer of my writing desk and took out a black leather notebook. Its pages were lined with calculations and notes, the sort of book I once used to track shipments and invoices. Tonight, I turned it into a ledger of a different kind. One by one, I wrote the expenses I had shouldered for Mason and Haley, the Bainbridge house mortgage, the property taxes, the insurance premiums, the platinum credit card I had co-signed, their yacht club fees, even their utility bills, which I had discreetly covered last winter when they fell behind. The list stretched across the page, a stark record of every sacrifice I had made in the name of family. By the time I set the pen down, my chest felt heavy, not from sorrow, but from clarity. Each line on that paper showed me what I had allowed, a life for them built on my silent labor, my steady transfers, my willingness to pretend that indulgence was love. Tonight, the cost of that silence had arrived in the form of a message telling me I was no longer welcome. I reached for the phone again, but not to answer Mason. I scrolled to Ruth Delgado's number and pressed call. She answered quickly, her voice calm as ever, professional but laced with familiarity. "Ruth," I said, steadying my tone. "Sorry for disturbing you on Christmas Eve. I won't take long." "Ben?" "No trouble at all. What's going on?" I looked at the notebook lying open before me, the ink still glistening. "I won't be at Christmas dinner this year," I said. My words were measured, deliberate. "But I'll be at your office first thing on the 26th. We need to talk." There was no pause on her end, no surprise, just a quiet, firm response. "I'll be ready." I hung up, switched off the porch lights, and let the house slip into darkness. Outside, other homes glittered with reds, greens, and golds, laughter spilling into the cold night. My porch stood in contrast, dark and silent. It suited me. This Christmas would not be about decoration or appearances. It would mark the beginning of something else entirely. A line drawn, a tide turning. I sat in the armchair by the window, notebook still open on the desk, and watched the reflection of the harbor lights flicker in the distance. The night felt colder than usual, but beneath that coldness, a strange calm spread through me. They had told me not to come. I would honor that request. But what awaited them after the 26th would be far from what they expected. If you're still watching and sensing how the tension is quietly building, please comment number 2 below to let me know you're with me. The morning after Christmas, I drove south along Highway 5 with rain streaking across the windshield, like veins of silver. The wipers squeaked in a steady rhythm, a metronome for the thoughts running through my mind. The world outside looked washed out, winter gray skies sagging over wet pavement, but inside me there was a sharpness I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't going to my son's house, I was going to my lawyer's office. Ruth Delgado had been part of my life for nearly 2 decades. She was as familiar with the inner workings of my estate as I was, maybe more. When I walked into her office, the smell of polished oak and the sight of orderly files calmed me. Her assistant offered me coffee, but I declined. I needed clarity, not warmth. Ruth stood behind her desk, 3 thick folders arranged in precise alignment across the polished surface. "Ben," she said, gesturing toward the leather chair opposite her. "I expected you." Now I nodded, taking my seat. My eyes went straight to the files. One bore the label Carter Family Living Trust, another Carter Maritime FLP. The third was a thinner folder marked QPRT, Hood Canal. Seeing them laid out like that was like staring at a map of my entire legacy, condensed into paper and ink. Ruth opened the trust file first. "This is where the monthly disbursements are authorized," she explained. "It also guarantees the credit cards and club memberships. All still intact. Unless you decide otherwise, I kept my hands folded, listening, not interrupting." She shifted to the FLP folder. "The Bainbridge property is held under the partnership. Technically, Mason and Haley are tenants. The trust covers their lease obligations, though they've never seen it that way." Her tone was professional, but I could hear the edge underneath. Even she, careful as she was, could not disguise her distaste for their entitlement. Finally, she tapped the QPRT file, "The cabin on Hood Canal. We've discussed securing it for the grandchildren. It's prepared but unsigned. That choice remains yours." I sat back, inhaling the scent of the rain-damp air drifting in from her half-open window. Each file felt like a mirror, reflecting back all the ways I had mistaken indulgence for love. Then Ruth leaned forward. "One more note. 6 weeks ago, Haley requested reimbursement from the trust for a lifestyle podcast project. She framed it as family branding. Omar rejected it, outside the allowable categories, but the attempt was telling. I gave a small nod. It didn't surprise me. It only confirmed what I already knew. They saw the trust as a spigot that should never stop flowing. I drew a slow breath. "Suspend the auto-pays for anything classified as luxury," I said. "The club, the premium services, the extras, but keep utilities, health insurance, and essentials covered for 30 days. After that, they'll need to stand on their own." Ruth jotted a note, her pen moving quickly. "Understood," And Ruth, I continued, my voice steady, revise the trust. Strengthen the no contest clause. If they challenge it, they forfeit everything. Her eyes met mine, sharp with approval. And the arbitration clause? Move it to Montana. The courts there are less forgiving of theatrics. She smiled faintly, sliding the trust file closer. For the first time in a long while, I felt not like a father chasing his son's approval, but like the architect of my own fortress. That sense of control lasted only a few minutes. Ruth's phone buzzed, and she excused herself to glance at the screen. A shadow crossed her expression. Ben, this came in overnight, from the fraud department of your brokerage. She opened an email, turned the monitor so I could see. I leaned forward, and the breath caught in my chest. It was an obituary. My name, my birth date, a false declaration of my death dated December 24th, Christmas Eve. Someone had submitted it to the brokerage, attempting to activate transfer on death provisions. For a moment, the room tilted. To be excluded from dinner was one thing. To be declared dead on paper, erased for the sake of money, that was another level entirely. My jaw tightened. Ruth studied me carefully. Do you want me to pursue this as elder financial abuse? I straightened in the chair. My voice was low, but every syllable carried weight. Freeze every account tied to TOD, file the report, open the case. And Ruth, make sure whoever did this understands they've woken the wrong man. She nodded, already dialing her compliance contact. The hum of her phone filled the room as I stared at the folders on her desk. Those files were more than documents. They were weapons. When I walked out of Ruth's office, the rain had not let up. Drops slid down the windshield as I sat behind the wheel, notebook still in my coat pocket. The storm outside mirrored the storm now fully breaking within me. This was no longer about disrespect. It was about attempted theft, about being written out of existence for convenience. As I pulled into traffic, I knew something had shifted. I was not just a father facing hurt feelings. I was a man preparing for battle, armed with paper, law, and the unshakable resolve of someone who had built everything from nothing. The time for silence had passed. The reckoning had begun. If you're still watching and noticing how the first cracks are starting to widen, please comment number 3 below to let me know you're with me. The rain hadn't let up by the time I left Ruth's office. Drops ran in crooked rivers down the windshield, blurring the city into watercolor shades of gray. I didn't drive straight home. Instead, I parked near a cafe by the marina, ordered nothing more than a black coffee, and pulled out my phone. The notebook from the night before was heavy in my coat pocket, the inked pages reminding me why this call mattered. Omar Patel answered on the second ring, his voice tight. Ben? You don't usually call this early. There's no time to lose, I said. You'll want to hear this. Someone filed a fake obituary for me with the brokerage on Christmas Eve. Fraud department caught it. It was meant to trigger the transfer on death silence on his end, then a sharp inhale. My God. That's serious. Do you suspect? I don't suspect, I cut in. I know who benefits. But let's not waste breath. Omar, I want all automatic payments suspended immediately. Gym memberships, yacht club dues, premium subscriptions, everything that isn't essential. Keep utilities, health insurance, and the basics for 30 days. After that, it all stops, he hesitated, then said carefully, Mason will not be happy. He'll call me, maybe storm in, accuse me of betrayal. This isn't about happiness anymore, I said. This is about principle. Draft a full report. I want every line accounted for. You'll have it by tonight, he promised. I ended the call and stared at the water outside the cafe window, where sailboats rocked against their moorings. The tide was out, and their keels sat tilted in the mud, waiting for the sea to return. It struck me that Mason and Haley were about to feel that same low tide, stranded, tilted, helpless without the steady current they had mistaken for endless. From the cafe, I drove to the local branch of the commercial bank. The manager, a man named Dennis, who had known me since the early days of Carter Marine, greeted me with a cautious smile. He must have seen something in my eyes, because his own expression sobered quickly. I need to make changes to the credit facilities, I told him. Any sub-accounts tied to the trust under Mason or Haley's names, freeze them. Effective today. Access is trustee only. Dennis nodded, no questions asked. He slid the paperwork across the counter, and I signed each page with deliberate strokes. The pen felt heavy, not from doubt, but from finality. These signatures were more than ink. They were the first nails sealing the door they had tried to walk through unchecked. By afternoon, the effects were already reaching Bainbridge. I didn't see it, but I imagined it clearly. Mason striding into a high-end furniture showroom, Haley by his side, choosing a dining table made of polished oak. He would hand over the platinum card with his usual air of entitlement, not even glancing at the total. Then the cashier, polite but firm, "I'm sorry, sir. The transaction has been declined." Mason's laugh would be short, incredulous. "Run it again." When the answer came back the same, his face would darken. Haley, embarrassed, would pull out her phone and craft a cryptic post. "Holiday ruined by technical issues," complete with a broken heart emoji. Within minutes, her friends would comment, speculating, offering sympathy, unaware of the deeper truth unraveling behind the scenes. The call to the bank would follow, Mason's voice raised, demanding answers. The response would be calm, professional. "I'm sorry, sir." This decision came directly from the trustee. I could picture him then, jaw clenched, blaming Omar for betrayal, slamming his phone down. Haley would glare at him, equal parts angry and afraid, already calculating how much of their curated life could survive without the credit lines they had treated as their birthright. While their panic simmered, I returned to the harbor in Port Townsend. The rain had eased into a fine mist, and the boards of the dock shone dark and slick. My old boat waited where it always had, weathered but loyal. I climbed aboard, replaced a worn line, tightened a cleat, and wiped down the wheel. The routine steadied me. Every knot tied, every surface scrubbed, was a reminder that discipline builds resilience. Back inside the cabin, I pulled out the notebook and added today's entries. Auto pays suspended, credit lines frozen, essentials maintained until January 26th. Each line was precise, like measurements in a shipwright's log. For once, my hand didn't tremble as I wrote. When I closed the book, I sat quietly, listening to the gulls cry overhead and the distant clang of a buoy bell. I knew Mason and Haley would not sit quietly in their gilded cage. They would push back, lash out, try to claw their way back to the life they believed was owed to them. But I had made my first moves carefully, like adjusting sails before a storm. The real wind hadn't hit yet. As twilight bled across the harbor, I stood on deck and watched the dark water stretch out to the horizon. This wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of a reckoning, and for the first time in years, I felt ready. If you're still watching and realizing how every attempt only makes things worse, please comment number 4 below to let me know you're with me. The first signs of panic came sooner than I expected. Mason tried to withdraw cash the morning after the freeze, only to find the ATM flashing a red-lettered message, "Account frozen. Contact your financial institution." Haley stood beside him, arms crossed tight, eyes darting to the people waiting in line behind them. He punched the machine again, as if brute force might change the numbers on the screen. When nothing happened, he cursed under his breath. They tried calling me next. Dozens of calls poured into the log of my blocked list, one after the other, each one cut off by the same automated response. "This number is not accepting calls." I knew the sound they were hearing, a sterile, dismissive tone that cuts sharper than a shouted insult. By noon, Mason had stormed into Omar Patel's office in downtown Seattle. Omar later described it to me in exact detail, as accountants are prone to do. Mason slammed his fist on the desk, his voice raised high enough to carry down the hallway. "You betrayed my family!" he roared. "You're supposed to protect us!" Omar, calm as always, removed his glasses and placed them neatly on the table. "Mason, I work for your father, not you. Please lower your voice." That only made him louder. "You've been feeding him lies, haven't you? Twisting everything. You'll regret this." The commotion brought two building security officers into the office. They stood like statues until Omar nodded. "Escort him out, please." Mason resisted, but only for a moment. The embarrassment of being marched past a row of receptionists and assistants must have cut deeper than the denial of funds. He left in a haze of humiliation, leaving Omar's office silent except for the sound of the elevator doors closing behind him. Meanwhile, Haley tried her own tactic. That afternoon, she sat before a ring light, eyes red, voice breaking on camera. She recorded a video in which she tearfully spoke of betrayal. "Sometimes," she said between sniffles, "the people who should love you most are the ones who cut you deepest." She posted it on her social media, wrapped in vague captions and dramatic music. The comments were not what she expected. Some friends offered sympathy, but others cut sharper. "No one forced you to live beyond your means." Another wrote, "Entitlement isn't betrayal, Haley." Within hours, she deleted the video, but not before screenshots circulated. The mask of curated perfection she had worn so carefully cracked, leaving her exposed in the very arena she cherished most. And me? I spent the day in the boat shed, sanding the hull of a half-built model ship Nora had once sketched. The plans were yellowed with age, edges curled, but her handwriting in the margins was as clear as if she had written it yesterday. Working with wood steadied me in a way nothing else could. Each stroke of sandpaper was a prayer, each curve a remembrance. Where Mason and Haley's world spun into chaos, mine narrowed to the grain of cedar and the faint smell of varnish. By nightfall, the storm broke in person. Their headlights flashed across the gravel road leading to my gate. I watched from inside, curtains drawn just enough for me to see without being seen. The iron gate clanged as Mason pounded on it, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. Haley pressed the intercom button again and again, her voice shrill through the speaker. "Dad, open the gate. We need to talk now." Mason's shout carried through the storm. Inside, I sat in my armchair, the fire glowing low, a record of Bach's cello suites spinning softly in the background. The monitor for the security cameras glowed beside me. On the screen, I could see them clearly. Mason's face contorted with rage, Haley's mascara streaking in the rain. They were drenched, desperate, pounding at the walls they thought they could break with sheer will. For a long moment, I just watched. Their anger, their pleading, their attempts to shame me into yielding, all of it played out like theater, a performance meant to reclaim control. But the truth was simple. They had none. I turned up the music slightly, letting the cello drown out the muffled sound of their shouts. My hand hovered over the intercom button, not out of temptation, but out of habit. In the end, I didn't touch it. Silence was my answer, stronger than any argument. On the screen, Mason's fists beat against the gate until his shoulders sagged. Haley covered her face with her hands, her body shaking with sobs. The rain fell harder, drumming on the hood of their car parked behind them. When they finally retreated, their figures shrinking into the night, I leaned forward and switched off the monitor. The room fell into a deeper silence. I closed my eyes, inhaled the scent of burning cedar, and felt the weight of the decision settle into me. It was not cruelty that kept me inside. It was clarity. I had learned at last that answering chaos with silence was not weakness. It was power. The morning after Mason and Haley stormed my gate, the garden was slick with dew. Roses bowed their heads under the weight of water, crimson petals glistening in the weak light. I sat with my coffee on the porch, watching the slow drip of rain slide from leaf to leaf. The night before still echoed in my mind. Mason's fists pounding against iron, Haley's shrill voice breaking through the storm. I had not opened the gate. I had chosen silence. But silence could not last forever. Was I going too far? Or was I finally doing what should have been done years ago? The questions pressed at me like cold hands. For decades I had given, smoothed over, covered the gaps. And still, my son had looked me in the eye, through a glowing phone screen, and told me not to come. That wound would never close if I left things as they were. By mid-morning, I was in Ruth Delgado's office again. Omar Patel sat across from me, his tie slightly askew, the weight of sleepless nights hanging in his eyes. Ruth had spread 2 neat stacks of papers across the table. Her voice was precise as always, the tone of someone guiding a client to see the battlefield ahead. "You have two choices, Ben," she began. "The first is to maintain the freeze. Keep them cut off from luxury spending, but allow essentials to continue. They'll remain dependent, still in crisis, but technically tethered to you. It buys time." She tapped the second stack. "The other option is decisive. Amend the trust. Remove them as beneficiaries altogether. Redirect the assets toward a protected purpose. That path ends the dependency, once and for all." Omar opened his laptop, the blue light reflecting off his glasses. "I've reviewed their accounts. Mason and Haley are liquidating what they can. Handbags, jewelry, even that Swiss watch you bought for Mason's 30th. But they've racked up fresh debt on secondary credit lines outside the trust. At this rate, they'll drown within months." He looked at me squarely. "If you let this drag on, they might file for bankruptcy, and in desperation, they could sue you. Even a weak case costs you time and peace." I rubbed a hand across my chin, the bristles rasping like sandpaper. "And the obituary?" Ruth slid a folder toward me. Inside was the printed copy, my name stamped in bold across a death notice I had not earned. "This is your leverage, a fraudulent filing with intent to access your accounts. It's elder financial abuse, plain and simple. You have more than enough evidence to justify amending the trust without fear of legal retaliation. We'll also strengthen the no contest clause. If they attempt to challenge, they'll lose everything." Her words landed heavy, but true. Still, my chest ached with something beyond logic. Mason was my son. I had rocked him to sleep in the small house Nora and I once shared. I had seen him take his first steps, had heard him call me dad with a joy that had felt like sunlight. Could I really cut him out completely? I leaned back in the chair, eyes closing, and in that silence, I heard her, Nora's voice, soft but resolute. "Love doesn't mean shielding him from consequences, Ben. Real love gives him the chance to stand, even if he falls first." The memory of her face was sharp in my mind, the way her eyes carried both warmth and steel. She had always seemed clearer than I had, unafraid of the hard truths I tried to soften. I opened my eyes, the decision clear. "We go with option 2, I said. My voice was steady, though I felt the tremor of finality beneath it. "Remove them. Redirect the assets. Draft the amendment immediately." Ruth nodded once, already reaching for her pen. "I'll prepare the documents. The endowment we discussed, the scholarship, can be formalized as the new beneficiary." Omar exhaled slowly, perhaps relieved that the indecision was gone. I stood, pushing the chair back. "They asked me for space. I'm finally giving it to them." When the meeting ended, I drove back toward Port Townsend. The afternoon light broke through the clouds, casting streaks of gold across the Sound. I pulled into my driveway, walked to the balcony that overlooked the water, and rested my hands on the railing. The tide was coming in, waves brushing the rocks with quiet insistence. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. The choice had been made. No more half measures, no more enabling. Mason and Haley would face the world without the cushion of my accounts, and I would face mine with a lighter heart. I whispered into the wind, barely louder than the waves. "Nora, I finally listened." The notice came first, bold black letters on a bright red sheet, taped across the polished mahogany door of their Bainbridge penthouse. Notice to vacate, non-payment of rent. The paper screamed louder than any argument. Haley discovered it when she stepped into the hallway to collect the package. She froze, the parcel slipping from her hand. "What is this?" she gasped, tearing the page free. Mason tried to sound confident, but his voice cracked. "It's a mistake. We own this place. My father bought it for us." Her eyes narrowed, trembling with disbelief. "Do we? Or does he?" For the first time, Mason admitted the truth. "The lease is in the trust's name." The words came out like stones dropped in water, heavy and final. Haley's scream echoed down the hallway. Neighbors peeked from behind their doors, curiosity masked as concern. She didn't care. Humiliation spread across her like wildfire. The second blow landed that afternoon. Haley's Range Rover, her prized possession, was parked outside the building, as it always was, gleaming white under a gray sky. But when she walked out with Mason, she saw a tow truck already hooked to the vehicle, its orange lights flashing. "That's my car!" she shouted, running forward. "You can't take it!" The driver didn't flinch, simply handed her the paperwork. Lessee, the Carter Family Living Trust. Account status, delinquent. Haley's knees buckled, tears spilling down her cheeks as a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk. Phones appeared, recording the spectacle. The same doorman who once rushed to open her door now stood with arms folded, expression neutral. Mason tried to pull her away, but she shoved him back, screaming that it was his fault. By evening, the humiliation had turned into survival. Mason drove their last remaining sedan to a supermarket. He filled a cart with groceries, cereal, milk, eggs, even some frozen dinners. The total was modest by their old standards, nothing more than $200. He handed over his card with forced confidence. "Declined," the cashier said flatly. "Run it again." Mason's jaw tightened. The second attempt failed, then the third. He tried another card, and another, each one spitting back the same cold verdict: declined. Shoppers in line whispered. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing. Mason's face burned red. Finally, he abandoned the cart, muttering curses under his breath as he stormed out. Back in the car, Haley exploded. "You're pathetic. You let him control everything. You told me we were secure." Mason slammed the steering wheel. "I didn't know he'd cut us off. You kept spending like it would never end." "Because you said it wouldn't," her voice cracked, raw with fury. "You've never been strong enough, Mason. Not for me, not for us." The silence after her words was heavier than the shouting. For the first time, a fracture appeared not just in their finances but in their marriage itself. Meanwhile, I sat in my study, a soft lamp glowing over the desk. Omar's report lay open before me. It detailed everything: the eviction notice, the repossession, the failed transactions. He included a note about items Mason and Haley had begun selling: handbags, watches, even furniture. The numbers showed what I already knew. They were drowning, and pawning their possessions was like trying to bail water from a sinking ship with a teacup. I read without glee. There was no satisfaction in their suffering, only a calm recognition that this was the inevitable consequence of choices long deferred. I made a note in my ledger: penthouse, vacate notice issued, Range Rover repossessed, credit cards frozen, essentials cut off January 26. Each line steadied me, a record of progress not toward revenge, but toward truth. The following morning I rose early, stepping into the garden where roses gleamed in the pale light. Dew clung to every petal, and the air smelled fresh, as if the world were being rinsed clean. I trimmed a branch, checked the soil, and wrote a few more lines in my notebook. Where their world was unraveling, mine was rooting deeper. While they fought with each other, I found quiet in the rhythm of ordinary tasks. For the first time in years, my days were not dictated by their demands, but by the simple pace of my own hands. Somewhere across the water, Mason sat in a penthouse already stripped of comfort, Haley pacing, muttering about what they'd lost. He had his head in his hands, and she was too angry to touch him. At last, he whispered the words that Omar would later repeat to me in a hushed voice. "We don't have anything left." That was the truth. They had hit bottom. And yet, I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the start of what came after, the place where desperation breeds either ruin or rebirth. The documents felt heavier than paper should: thick leather covers, embossed letters, and pages lined with clauses that cut through years of habit. Ruth slid the file toward me, her expression steady but not unkind. "It's ready, Ben," she said. "The Carter Family Living Trust has been amended. Mason and Haley are no longer beneficiaries. All assets are redirected to the Carter Next Generation Fund. Once you sign, this becomes irrevocable." I picked up the pen. For decades, I had signed checks, transfers, allowances. Every stroke of ink another stitch in the net that held my son suspended above the real world. Now my signature would cut that net. My hand was steady as I wrote my name across the final page. Ruth closed the file. It's done. Omar, seated across from me, adjusted his glasses. Mason and Haley are already drowning. Their debts grow by the week. Friends won't bail them out forever. And with the no contest clause we've reinforced, they have no legal ground to challenge you. I nodded. The knot in my chest loosened, replaced by something lighter. Relief, perhaps, or the first breath of freedom after being locked inside for too long. While I was walking out of Ruth's office, Mason was making calls of his own. One to an old fraternity brother in Chicago, another to a golf partner who had once admired his Rolex. Each ended the same way: polite refusals, vague excuses, quick disconnections. The wealthy circle that had seemed so solid around him turned out to be nothing more than a mirage, built on the assumption of endless inheritance. Haley tried her hand at survival. She stepped into a boutique clothing store, resume in hand, though it was little more than a list of charity galas and brand collaborations. The manager glanced at it, then at her manicured nails and trembling smile. "We'll let you know," he said, slipping the page into a pile that would never be touched again. Outside, Haley blinked against the winter wind, mascara smudging. For the first time in her adult life, no one rushed to open a door for her. Mason fared no better. He sat in the fluorescent light of a small logistics firm, trying to sound authoritative as he explained his management skills. The interviewer leaned back, unimpressed. "You've never held a full-time job?" "I've overseen investments," Mason countered. "Investments managed by your father's trust?" The question cut like a blade. Mason's cheeks flushed. The interview ended within minutes. He left the office with his shoulders hunched, the weight of useless pride dragging him down. I didn't need to see their failures in person. Omar's weekly reports arrived with the precision of a surgeon's notes. Credit card balances climbing, personal possessions listed for consignment, late notices piling up. I read each line, then closed the folder without bitterness. It wasn't joy I felt, it was clarity. The world was teaching them lessons I had failed to deliver. Back home, I returned to the garden. Winter roses still clung to life, their thorns sharper than ever. I pruned carefully, cutting back the dead stems so the living could breathe. Dirt under my nails, the smell of damp soil in the air. This was the work that gave me peace. Later that evening, I opened my leather-bound notebook and added another entry. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, trust amended, fund established. Mason and Haley, no longer my dependents. I paused, then added a final line, one I had whispered to myself earlier that day. No longer the provider, now the one who sets the limits. The house was quiet. For once, the silence didn't feel heavy with absence. It felt clean, like the air after a storm. I sat back, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, and realized the weight I had carried for so long was gone. Across the water, Mason and Haley faced a future stripped of privilege. Their penthouse was no longer theirs. Their car gone, their friends indifferent, their credit worthless. They were left with only themselves, raw and unprepared. Whether they broke apart or built something real would be up to them. As for me, I had made my choice, and in that choice I had found peace. The apartment they found was nothing like the penthouse they had once boasted about. It sat above a laundromat on a crowded street, the faint hum of washing machines vibrating through the thin floorboards. The ceilings were low, the windows drafty, and the kitchen barely large enough for two people to stand in at once. Yet it was the only place they could afford. Mason rose before dawn each day, pulling on a high-visibility vest and steel-toed boots. His new job at the port was simple: oversee pallets as they were loaded and unloaded from trucks, sign off on deliveries, and occasionally lend a hand when extra manpower was needed. The work left his back aching, his palms blistered, but for the first time in his life, he earned his paycheck. The silence of his coworkers said more than words. Their respect was measured not in compliments, but in the fact that they no longer looked at him with open disdain. Haley, meanwhile, folded sweaters at a retail store in the local mall. She stood behind the counter, ringing up sales, answering questions about sizes. The fluorescent lights drained her, and by the end of her shift, her feet throbbed in shoes that were never meant for long hours of standing. Yet, she kept showing up, her pride swallowed, her curated online persona long abandoned. She had deleted most of her social media, unable to endure the comments that still lingered under old posts. Their dinners had become humble affairs, a box of pasta, a jar of store-brand sauce, sometimes a cheap bottle of wine if Mason had managed overtime pay. They sat across from each other at a chipped wooden table, steam rising from mismatched bowls. Conversation was often sparse, punctuated by sighs and the scrape of forks. Arguments still flared, but they were shorter now, less performative. The energy for drama had drained away, leaving only exhaustion and the beginnings of something honest. While their world shrank, mine expanded into a new chapter. On the morning of the inaugural ceremony for the Carter Next Generation Fund Scholarship, I stood before the mirror in my bedroom, straightening a tie that had once belonged to Nora. The fabric was worn, but it carried her scent, faint as memory. I smoothed my jacket, took a deep breath, and felt steadier than I had in years. The drive to the university was calm. The campus came into view with its brick buildings and wide lawns dotted with students hurrying between classes. A banner stretched across the entrance of the auditorium. Carter Next Generation Fund Scholarship, Inaugural Ceremony. Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation. Rows of students and their families filled the seats, faces bright with pride and nerves. The space was modest compared to the gala halls Mason and Haley once paraded through, but there was a warmth here no chandelier could provide. When I stepped onto the stage, the applause surprised me. It wasn't the polite clapping of social obligation. It was real, heavy with gratitude. I approached the podium, rested my notes on the surface, and looked out at the sea of young faces. For a moment, my throat tightened. I thought of Nora, of what she would have said standing here with me. My life began in a boatyard, I started, my voice echoing gently. I worked with my hands, with wood and salt air, long before I knew what comfort felt like. Every step of my career was built on mistakes, sweat, and long nights. What I learned is simple. Legacy isn't what you leave for people, it's what you leave inside them. The words flowed easier than I expected. I spoke of labor, of dignity, of the courage to stand after failure. I told them that scholarships were not gifts, but investments. Investments in futures that would outlive me, in strength that no luxury could replace. When I finished, the applause filled the hall, rising like a tide. I smiled, not with triumph, but with a quiet peace that settled deep in my chest. At that same hour, across town, Mason stood on a loading dock, clipboard in hand. Sweat trickled down his temple as he guided a forklift operator, his body weary but his eyes focused. He was no longer a prince without a kingdom. He was just another man earning his way. Haley, in her store, folded another stack of jeans, her hands moving steadily, her mind elsewhere. They were learning, however painfully, what I could not teach them with money. The contrast was sharp. I stood in the light of a stage, the applause washing over me. They stood in the shadows of ordinary labor, stripped of glamour, but clothed, at last, in reality. For me, resolution had come not from punishing them, but from choosing a new direction. I had stepped away from the role of provider and into the role of a man building something that might last beyond my lifetime. The house was quiet when I returned from the ceremony. The applause still rang faintly in my ears, though the silence of my garden quickly softened it. Evening had settled in, painting the sky in strokes of lavender and copper. I lowered myself into the old wooden chair by the roses, the same chair where I had spent countless hours, thinking, grieving, deciding. The blooms swayed gently in the breeze, red petals glowing like small lanterns against the dimming light. I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the past months fall away. From the moment Mason had sent that cruel text to this day, the journey had been painful, cutting me open in ways I never thought possible. Yet, as I sat there, I realized I was not broken. I was lighter, freer. I had found peace not by holding tighter, but by letting go. Inside, my notebook lay open on the table. I picked up the pen and wrote in slow, deliberate strokes. Love must carry boundaries. Without them, it rots into entitlement. The ink sank deep into the page, the words carrying a truth I had taken a lifetime to learn. For decades, I believed love meant sacrifice, that shielding my son from hardship honored Nora's memory. But shielding had warped into spoiling, and sacrifice had bred contempt. What Mason needed was not more money, it was the space to fail, to fall, and perhaps to stand again. Across town, Mason finished his shift at the port. His clothes smelled of diesel and salt air, his hands rough from the work. He walked back to the small apartment, shoulders slumped, but not with arrogance, just fatigue. Haley met him at the door, a bag of groceries clutched in her arms. They ate pasta in silence, the steam rising in thin curls. There were no extravagant bottles of wine, no reservations at glittering restaurants. Just two people sharing food, their conversation quieter, their anger less sharp than before. Something had shifted. They were not healed, not yet, but there was the faint outline of acceptance. As I leaned back, the phone on the side table buzzed. I almost ignored it. For 6 months, I had grown used to its silence, or at least the silence I imposed upon it, but curiosity stirred, and I reached for it. The screen glowed in the dim light, showing a number I didn't recognize. The message contained just a single word, followed by a question mark. Dad? I stared at it for a long moment, my thumb hovering above the glass. It wasn't a demand for money, it wasn't an accusation or a command. It was not laced with entitlement or arrogance. It was fragile, uncertain, as if Mason himself wasn't sure he deserved the word. A smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. Not triumph, not revenge, something quieter. It was the smile of a man who finally understood the power of choice. For years, Mason had dictated the terms. He asked, I gave. He demanded, I supplied. Now, for the first time, the decision rested entirely with me. I set the phone down, screen facing the table, the message still unread in the digital sense. I didn't need to respond, not yet. Time was mine to control, and silence was still my strongest answer. The roses rustled as the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of earth and bloom. I whispered, so quietly that only the night could hear. Space was the gift. Respect will be the return. I thought of Nora then, her gentle strength, her unflinching wisdom. She had always believed that love meant more than comfort. It meant preparing the ones we love to face the world without us. I had failed for years, but perhaps it wasn't too late. Mason and Haley had been stripped of illusions. Whether they rebuilt themselves or crumbled was no longer my burden. It was theirs. The stars appeared one by one, steady points of light above the darkening garden. I sat there, listening to the quiet hum of the world, no longer burdened by the chaos of another's demands. For the first time in decades, the silence did not feel like absence. It felt like possibility. I knew one day I might answer that message. I might sit across from my son, not as a bank, not as a resource, but as a man who had drawn the line and refused to step back. Until then, I would keep tending the roses, building the scholarship, leaving behind something stronger than money. Because in the end, the greatest act of fatherhood was not endless giving. It was the courage to say no. It was the strength to give space. And it was the faith that, in that space, a child might finally learn to stand. In the end, every story about broken trust and fractured love leads back to the same truth. Boundaries are not barriers. They are the scaffolding of respect. Without them, affection collapses under the weight of entitlement. With them, love has room to breathe and grow. What once seemed cruel in the moment, the silence, the refusal, the drawing of lines, becomes in hindsight the greatest act of care because it forces people to stand on their own feet and discover strength that was always theirs to claim. We often mistake provision for love, imagining that to give endlessly is to protect. Yet protection without accountability is a fragile shield, one that warps into dependency and resentment. True care requires courage, the courage to say no, to allow consequences, to believe that those we love are capable of more than comfort. It is a harder love, quieter and less celebrated, but it is the kind that builds resilience instead of fragility. There is also the deeper lesson of legacy. Wealth, property, and status are fleeting. They can be lost, squandered, or stolen. But the values instilled through discipline, the lessons etched into a life lived with integrity, endure. A legacy is not measured in what is left behind materially, but in what continues within others long after we are gone. The respect for hard work, the dignity of self-reliance, the humility to learn, and the gratitude to grow. Sometimes the most profound gift is space, the distance necessary for growth, the silence that invites reflection, the absence that reveals what truly matters. In that space lies the possibility of renewal, of respect earned rather than demanded. And it is in that difficult, sacred space that love, stripped of illusion, finally becomes real. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage, it's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to, and how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.